My name is Glenn Campbell. I am best known to the world as the Area 51 activist from the 1990s. Area 51, of course, is the secret military base in the Nevada desert about 100 miles north of Las Vegas. I did not invent Area 51. I did not make any exotic claims about Area 51. My claim to fame is that in the 1990s, I made this fringe story, known only to UFO watchers and aircraft watchers. I turned this fringe story into a mainstream story that was palatable to the mainstream media. So in the 1990s, I got my 15 minutes of fame, maybe even my 45 minutes of fame. As a promoter of Area 51, I guided countless film crews and print journalists around the perimeter of this secret base that at the time the government never acknowledged. I was also known later as the family court guy in Las Vegas. For 2.5 years I served as a family court activist in Las Vegas, where I got a little bit of attention, but not nearly the attention I got for Area 51. After that, I was a world traveler. I got a job with an airline, which turned into 10 years of world travel in which I saw some 87 countries. Now, right now, I'm going to talk to you about something completely different. I'm going to talk to you about what I think my greatest contribution to humanity may be. This is my most important project, and if I complete it, it will be my most important accomplishment. It is a book called Demographic Doom: Why the World is Falling Apart. I've been working on this book for about 9 months now. The first draft is maybe 80% complete. You can actually read what I've already written on my website called demographicdoom.com, and where I have a PDF of what I've already written. You can read it right now. There is some urgency in my talking about this right now. I am facing a major life crisis that has come on quite suddenly. I am facing a probable cancer diagnosis, possibly fatal. And you may think this is a terrible thing to have cancer, that this is just a tragedy. I see this as an enormous opportunity to get focused on what is really important. And two things are important to me. One is preserving my digital legacy, all of the essays and many newsletters and things that I've written over the years. I want to have those preserved. But I also want to complete what I consider this very important project, this possibly the most important project that I can write. And in this video, I'm going to try to explain this project to you. Now, I've worked on the manuscript, but this is the first time I've tried to record a video about the project. And the aim here is to explain in sort of an oral terms, in express terms, why this is important, what the gist of my book is, why this is the most important thing in the world. The topic of the book is demography. And demography is the study of human populations. It's basically, you're just basically counting people and sorting them into categories and seeing how those categories change over time. You know, so many people are born every year and so many people die every year. And demography is the study of how those people change over time. And it turns out that we're facing the planet Earth is facing a number of severe demographic problems, demographic crises. They're all going to come home to roost very quickly. One of these crises you may have heard of. It's called a population explosion, which was popularized in the 60s and 70s by a book called The Population Bomb. Population explosion said that we're all going to die because the population has grown from 1 billion at 1900 to 7 billion now. We're all running out of space. And it turns out this is a lie, that in fact the population explosion has already abated, and it is no longer the greatest crisis facing humanity. In fact, a much greater crisis may be a population implosion. So in my book, I discuss actually 9 different demographic processes. They're all working together to erode the future of humanity. And this is the only book, although there are books on population explosions and population implosions, there's no book that tries to integrate all of these processes into one worldview. So, but before I get into the book itself, I'd like to give you a little review of my life. And my life has been a complicated one. Of course, I was born in 1959. A lot of things happened between the 1959 and the 1990s. I'm not going to get into those, because the 1990s is when I became famous. I became the Area 51 guy. And I want to tell you how that happened. I got interested. I had I was involved in a software project in Cambridge, Mass. I was able to cash out of that. I had some money to coast by on for a while. And I got into UFOs. I got into UFOs not necessarily because I believed in them, but because I thought they were a fascinating mystery that you could start to apply some logic to. You know, either they exist or they don't exist, and you could apply some science to them. And there was one place on Earth where you could supposedly see UFOs on demand on a scheduled basis, and that was Area 51. That was outside the secret military base in Nevada. So this was recorded in the fringe media, the UFO media. And I initially, in late 1992, I went to visit Area 51, the public highways outside of Area 51, to look for UFOs. I saw some fantastic UFOs, and after a while I came to understand what they were. They were not alien craft. They were flares and things connected with the war games exercises that were also taking place near this secret base. So when I first went to Area 51, I found no aliens. I found no UFOs. What I did find is a real secret base that the government wasn't talking about and that the world wasn't talking about. The only people who knew about this base were secret aircraft watchers and UFO nuts. And I saw this base. I saw that it existed. I saw it with my own eyes, and I realized this just cries out for attention. So I took it upon myself to become the base publicist, to draw attention to this base. And I did this by moving out to the nearest town, to Area 51 in 1993, to write a book, what was supposed to be a little pamphlet, but turned into a real book called the Area 51 Viewer's Guide, where I assembled, I didn't know what was going on in the base, but I could assemble all the data that I did know about how to view the base, what we did know about the base, what we knew about the aircraft operating there, and what we knew about things that look like UFOs but that didn't. And I worked for most of 1993 on this book. It was a very lonely time. It was just before the internet, 1993. And I was all alone in this very small town. I had some contacts. I would actually write letters to people to communicate with people, because you did that before the internet. Things took off in 1994 when I started a newsletter and really got organized. My aim here was to attract mainstream attention to this secret base, because I thought it cried out for attention. And the first nibble I got was from the Wall Street Journal, which ran a very small, very short piece around the end of 1993. That opened the floodgates to all the other legitimate media. So the New York Times came, Time Magazine, Newsweek, Der Spiegel, all the legitimate media piled on board as soon as the Wall Street Journal started reporting it. So 1994 for me was a very busy year when I was continuously entertaining the media. And my position was that I would be this one sane voice among all these insane claims. And it was wildly successful. I turned Area 51 from a fringe story into a mainstream story. I even had a hidden role in how the X-Files portrayed Area 51. So I was kind of in the middle of things in 1994 and 1995. Now, right now, as I sit here, my feelings about Area 51 are very ambiguous. I'm not sure that I accomplished anything. I'm not sure that my stay there was worthwhile. I contributed, I may have helped give voice to a lot of conspiracy theories. Even though I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I may have helped give a voice to a lot of conspiracy theories that shouldn't have had a voice. I may have contributed in some small way to all the conspiracy theories that led Donald Trump to power, which is very embarrassing to me. The one thing I can say about my sojourn at Area 51 is that it was highly educational. It was like a graduate program in media and law and government and sociology and psychology. I learned so many things about so many important topics at Area 51. And I was obsessed with it. You could say I might have been unhealthily obsessed with it. I kept at it for several years. I eventually had my fill of living in remote Rachel, which was 2.5 miles from your nearest Walmart. I eventually moved to Las Vegas, where I lived in an apartment that just happened to overlook the secret air terminal at McCarran Airport, where all the workers for Area 51 loaded onto planes and flew to their bases. So just by coincidence, my apartment looked straight out onto the tarmac, where all these Area 51 workers. So I could move to Las Vegas without claiming to give up Area 51. Anyway, as the 1990s progressed, I kind of faded out of Area 51. My next big adventure was to get married. I married a woman with 4 children from previous marriages. Like Area 51, it was an enormous education. It was also a practical disaster, and that my wife freaked out. My wife became insane, and things got very frightening. I had a most horrendous divorce, horrible divorce in which I lost my family. I have no biological children of my own, but there were children that I considered my own who I lost. It was a disaster. I went through I lost all my money. I went through a bankruptcy. I went through this horrible divorce. And this led me actually into my next phase of my life, which was family court guy. I became involved in family court as a litigant in my own divorce, as a litigant trying to get access to a child who I raised for her first 5 years, for her first 6 years. I was essentially the father to a child who I lost access to because I was not physically related to the child. So for 2.5 years, I became the family court guy in Las Vegas. Family court consists of juvenile delinquency and child abuse and divorce and adoption and all sorts of things that I really found fascinating aspects of both law and psychology. And my aim at this point was to bring the same sort of attention to family court that I had brought to Area 51. It was so easy for me to draw the mainstream media to Area 51. I figured I would just use the same techniques in family court. I would have a newsletter. I would put out good information about how the court works. It never really panned out. There was one very good feature story written by Molly Ball of the Las Vegas Sun, which I'm very proud of, which kind of captured my role at the time. But otherwise, I got very little attention for this new cause. And the main reason is there's no aliens. There's no aliens in family court. There are no flying saucers in family court. There aren't many exotic conspiracy theories. So although I got some attention within the court itself, people were reading my newsletters, I was not getting the global attention that I felt I could get. And I eventually faded out of this. Maybe after 2.5 years, I faded out of the family court business. My next life adventure is that I became a world traveler. And in 2007, I got a job as a baggage handler for U.S. Airways in Las Vegas. And one of the perks of being a baggage handler is you got unlimited free airfare on my own airline, U.S. Airways. So what I could do is I could work 4 days a week as a baggage handler in Las Vegas. Then I could literally, at the end of my shift, jet off to Venice, Italy, or Paris, France, or Rome, and spend 24 hours in Rome and do a whirlwind tour of Rome or Venice. And I took advantage of this. I traveled all the time, as far as I could go within the tiny bits of time I had. I made many trips to Hawaii. I could just bounce over to Hawaii and sleep on the beach in Hawaii. I could go into the Caribbean, fly to the Virgin Islands and sleep on the beach in Virgin Islands. The only downer about working for an airline is they expect you to work, which means you've only got 2 or 3 days to do these whirlwind tours, and then you got to get back for your regular shift or you get fired, which is a big downer. It was a big difficulty in having all this free travel. And this difficulty was solved for me in the summer of 2008 when I got laid off. And I got laid off because the airline, U.S. Airways, closed its entire hub at Las Vegas and shut down all their flights out of Las Vegas and laid off about 800 people. And of those 800 people laid off, I was among the lowest of seniority. The thing is, technically, I was still on recall. They could still call me back. And as long as I was on recall, I still got my free travel. I still got my free flights. So I worked for the airline for 1 year, but after that I got 3 years of free travel without the inconvenience of having to work for it. So this to me was like winning the travel lottery. I got to fly for free anywhere. It could only be U.S. Airways, but I could fly anywhere U.S. Airways for a very low price. It might cost me $50 round trip to fly to Venice, Italy. The only problem I had is now I had to find a way to financially support myself. And I hit on this idea, and this idea was to drive people's cars across the country. Since I could fly for free, I could fly to wherever the car might be and drive it to wherever the client might want the car driven. And my bread and butter business, this took off right away as soon as I was laid off. My bread and butter business would be driving cars and pets between the northeast of the U.S. and Florida. And what you have is people called snowbirds who have winter homes in Florida and summer homes in the northeast, and they commute between the two. And most of these people are elderly, and they don't want to drive anymore, so they're willing to hire somebody to drive their car and their precious dog down to Florida in the fall and back in the spring. And so that became my business. And I also served the whole rest of the country. So if you were you're moving from New York to Los Angeles and you don't want to drive yourself, and maybe you have a nice dog you need to transport, I would transport your dog and your car for you. And I even had about 6 trips to Alaska, to and from Alaska, and including 2 trips from Alaska to the States in the wintertime, which was a great adventure. So I've seen all of North America as this driver. This driving gig of mine lasted 10 years, from 2008 until just about 2 weeks ago, when my driving career was over. So in that 10 years, I like to say I saw a lot of Walmarts. Sam's Club, Costco's. I've known every interstate highway in the country. I've seen every tourist attraction in the country. And to me, it was very conducive to my lifestyle, because when I'm driving, my brain is free. I can think about my other projects. I always have other projects that I'm working on. I have videos I'm working on, or philosophy essays, or books. I always have something in those 10 years. I always had something else I was working on. And driving was ideal because I could drive for a while, I could stop, I could pull over to the side of the road and work on my computer on whatever my project might be at the time. And that was a great scam. What was nice about the scam, now I said that I had 3 years of free flight. That free flight ended, and I dealt with that ending by simply raising my driving rates and charging people for my airfare. So I would go from drive to drive to drive. I was homeless, permanently homeless during these 10 years because I would just go from drive to drive, and my rate would have to be high enough to cover the flight into whatever city where I was picking up these cars. So it was a great scam even after I lost my flight, because after I lost my flight, I started paying for my flights. And in the process, I got frequent flyer miles for all of my flights, which gave me this essentially the same sort of free travel that I had when I worked for an airline. So my pattern was to drive for 10 months out of the year in the U.S., and then 2 months out of the year, scattered throughout the year, I would travel overseas. I would use my frequent flyer miles to travel overseas, and I went to some amazing exotic places. I have circumnavigated the globe in 2015, and in 2016 I went to Kazakhstan and several other countries in Central Asia. And in 2017 I drove around Southern Africa. I visited some 7 countries in Africa in June of 2017. So during this period, I visited 87 countries. I became this permanent world traveler who saw all of these countries and saw how the world lived. When I'm traveling overseas, I'm traveling on my own nickel, so I'm always doing it cheaply. I'm staying in hostels and occasionally renting cars and just sleeping in the rental cars. So I've seen an awful lot of the world. I've seen a representative sample of the world. I've visited every country in Europe except for Russia, which won't have me because of visa complications. I've seen a good portion of Africa. I've seen countries I've been to Quito, Ecuador, and Medellin, Colombia, Bogota, Colombia, and some countries in the Far East. I've even been to Shanghai and Thailand and Malaysia and North Korea. So I've had a pretty good sampling of the world. But as I said, this all ended 1 week ago. This all ended July 4th, 2018. My driving career ended. And my driving career ended when I'm driving in a small RV across Colorado. And I had a seizure at the wheel and I blacked out. Fortunately, the accident was very minor. The damage to the vehicle was limited. Although I was unconscious, I must have somehow brought the vehicle to a stop. And I was not seriously injured apart from this bump to my head. I was not seriously injured, but I was unconscious. And the passerbys had to break the window to get me out of the vehicle. And my first memory on July 4th was waking up in an ambulance. I was brought to the emergency room in the St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction, Colorado, where I was admitted for 2 nights. Went to the emergency room, then was admitted to the hospital for 2 nights. And in the course of this hospital stay, they took CAT scans of my head and my chest, and they found all sorts of stuff that doesn't belong there. Well, they found essentially metastasized cancer throughout my body. I've got a lump in my brain right here where it doesn't belong that kind of makes this eye bulge out a little bit. And I've got a lump on my chest that seems to be growing every day. And I've got all sorts of growths within my chest cavity. And this may seem like a terrible thing, that there's a very real risk I may die of this, because this is not cancer that has been caught at an early stage. This is a very late stage cancer, and so any treatment that there's going to be is going to be very invasive and very difficult. Now, I am back in Massachusetts now, and I'm beginning all of the tests and all the biopsies and things that I need to determine what happens next. But just on the surface of things, they don't look good. It kind of looks like I have an expiration date here, and that the chances of a full recovery from this are slim to none. Now, I could be able to squeeze out a lot of time between now and my ultimate demise. That remains to be seen. Right now, I'm feeling good in that my brain is still functioning well. I'm still alert. I also happen to be extremely weak. So if I were to stand up, I'm very weak. I've lost my appetite. This is part of a 2-week mystery disease that I experienced leading up to the seizure. I just got weaker and weaker. I had all these effects on my face. I had numbness in my face. I had a loss of appetite. I was feeling very weak. I spent 3 weeks in Europe and in June, and most of the time I spent in my hostel bunk, just working on my computer because I didn't have the energy to get up. So all this was a precursor to this eventual seizure. So now I'm facing these life-changing circumstances, which is potentially fatal cancer, the loss of my driving business, because just one seizure on the highway, just one black out of the road is proof enough that I can't drive anymore. So you would think this is a bad thing, but I see it as a good thing. I see, because my brain is good, this is just getting me focused on what is important. And you could see that my travel thing, all the travel I did, it could be seen as kind of an addiction that's taking me away from the things that are important. And now that I'm focused, now that I have a possible time limit on my participation on Earth, now I am deeply focused on what I think is really important. And what I think is really important is these 2 things, is that preserving my digital heritage, my digital records, and completing this one very important book on demography. So now I'm going to talk about the book, and I'm going to talk about, try to convince you that, as I believe, that demography is the single most important topic in the world, because it is determining what the future of humanity is going to be. And we are facing, in the near term, and the long term, we are facing some major demographic and financial crises. You may recall the financial crisis of 2008, where the where the world economy nearly melted down and was only saved by intervention from central banks and governments. I contend that the next crisis, which is just around the corner, will be far worse, and it's going to take out our entire banking system. And part of my book, the demographic book, is talking about the demographic reasons why this crisis must happen. So other people have written books about demography, and other people have written books about the population explosion. And there are other books about the population implosion. There's a very good book called What to Expect When No One is Expecting, which talks about the crisis in the lack of births. Japan is the poster child for lack of births. They are losing population because they simply can't produce enough babies. But what there are not books about is looking at all the broader demographic problems, because I identify not just 2 demographic problems, but 9 demographic problems that no one is really talking about. I have no credentials in demography. I'm not a statistician. I'm not an academic. But no one has written this book, so someone needs to write it. And back in October of last year, I decided, of all the books that are in my head, all the things I want to write, this is the single most important book that I can get out. And even back then, I'm thinking, if I die tomorrow, if I die and produce only 1 book, this is the book that I want to produce. Demographic Doom: Why the World is Falling Apart. Now, I say that there are 9 demographic processes going on here. We do have a real population explosion, but it is very limited to equatorial Africa. South Africa, for example, is not exploding in population. Other countries in that region are bringing their populations down rapidly. You still have population explosions in places like Niger and Sudan and Nigeria. In Niger, for example, the average woman produces 6 to 7 babies per woman, which is called the fertility rate for a country. You still have a population explosion there, but it is very limited. It is limited to Africa, maybe a few isolated spots in the Middle East, but the population explosion, as the hysteria would have it in the 1960s and 70s, has ended. In the rest of the world, in the developed world, in Europe and North America and South America and Asia, we have almost the opposite problem, which is a population implosion, where countries are not producing enough babies to refresh their populations. And this is especially bad in Japan, where the fertility rate, which is the number of babies produced per woman, is down around 1.4 or 1.5, and you need about 2.1 babies to refresh your population. And Japan's population the birth rate has been down for decades. Japan's population grew after World War II, but mainly because Japanese people lived longer. Their lifespans greatly, and we all know how long the Japanese live into their 80s. So the population continued to grow in Japan, but it has taken a downward turn. We've got to come to the end of that trend, and now Japan is falling in population in absolute terms. What's also important is that Japan is aging. Another one of their demographic problems is that in the developed world, populations are aging. Everyone is getting older, and there are many more retired people. And the problem with that is that you're losing your workforce. When people retire, they stop paying taxes, and instead they start being a drain on the government. And this has happened in Japan, where tons of people are retiring and expecting government pensions and government health care. And no one is entering the workforce. The workforce is shrinking year after year. And normally what happens is that the taxes paid by the workers pay for the benefits paid to the elderly people, and there aren't enough workers anymore. So we have this genuine crisis in Japan. And this crisis in Japan is being funded by its absolutely huge debt. You may think that Greece is heavily indebted, but the country in the world that is most heavily indebted is Japan, where the level of federal government debt is about 230% of GDP. GDP is the total economic output of the country. So the country is producing so much business over the course of the year, and the government debt is almost 2.5 times what that business, which is utterly unpayable. And right now, the Japanese government, of all the taxes the Japanese government takes in, some 40% of those taxes is simply interest being paid on its huge debt. So Japan is dying. Japan is going under. Japan is dying in terms of total population. It has already peaked in population. Japan's highest population was 128 million a couple years ago. It's now down to 127 million. It's on track to lose 500,000 people every single year, which is a little bit like a bomb going off of Nagasaki every year, except there's no bloodshed. These are silent bombs that are nonetheless killing Japan. And by the year 2060, Japan's population will be down 1/3 to about 87 million. And Japan is going to continue to be this incredibly shrinking country that one way or another cannot survive. And Japan is just the most prominent example of this. Right across the sea in China, you have another version of Japan. Now you may think that China is slated to take over the world. It seems to be holding all the cards right now. It has all the power. It is loaning money to third world countries and engaging in all the projects the United States used to engage in to build bridges, and it is building its hegemony around the world. It will soon surpass the United States as the world's biggest economy. And you may think, well, the biggest danger here is China. Well, it's not, because China is sitting on a time bomb. And China's time bomb was set off by something called the one-child policy, which was initiated in the 1980s, whereby the government mandated that each urban couple in big cities would have only a single child between them. So you have a mother and father and only one child. And this was intended to address what was at the time a real population explosion in China. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s in China, there was a real population explosion. They were growing, they were having huge families. They were outstripping their resources. The growth in Chinese population was alarming to everyone, including the Communist Party. So the party, being a totalitarian regime, landed on a plan to stop the population explosion. And when you're faced with a problem like that, you're faced with going too far into one extreme, the natural tendency is to try to go in the other extreme. And the Chinese government went in the direction of forcing people to have only one baby. This was strictly enforced with forced abortions, for example, and severe penalties for any parents who had more than one child. And it was wildly successful. It worked. They were able to bring their population way down, their birth rate way down. It never quite reached a birth rate of 1.0 because certain families, like rural families in farms, were allowed to have 2 children, and certain ethnic groups were allowed to have 2 children. So it never got quite down to what we call a fertility rate of 1.0, but it's pretty damn low. It's something around 1.3, 1.4 in China right now, and there's no hope of bringing it back. Now, the Chinese government has since changed its tune. It has reversed the one-child policy and instituted a 2-child policy. So couples can now have 2 children without any permissions. They just go ahead and have them. The only trouble is they've already trained these people to not have children. Once you've convinced people to not have children, it's very hard to convince them to have them again, because the costs and risks and losses of opportunity that are involved in having children are just immense. Basically, having children makes no economic sense. It makes no sense for people to have children. There's so many risks involved and so many costs involved that once you convince people to not have babies and you give them access to birth control, they're going to use it. And even if you allow them to have as many babies as they want, they still don't want babies. So this is the problem facing China today. Now, you wouldn't think there's a problem because China is still benefiting from its high birth period. Now, what we know about China is that in the 1990s, it became an economic powerhouse because it had a huge resource of cheap labor. And all that cheap labor was born before the one-child policy. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had these huge population explosion, which provided all of this cheap labor that built China's economy. So the fact that the birth rates dropped after that was not a bad thing for China, because now you have fewer children to support. This is what is called a demographic dividend. It happens only once in the history of a country. It is when the population, when birth rates suddenly fall from high to low. So what happens when a high birth rate falls to a low birth rate is you've got a ton of active workers producing economic activity, and you have very few of what are called dependents. And dependents are children under the age of 18 who are not producing any income, who are simply drawing on the resources of society, and elderly people who would be not working and also drawing on the resources of society. And during a demographic dividend, you have lots of workers and very few dependents. Very few young and old people, which is great for a country for a while. So it has been great for China since the 1990s. China has benefited from this windfall of a huge number of workers and a low number of dependents. The only trouble is they haven't had the children in the pipeline anymore to refresh their population. So inevitably what's going to happen in China is exactly what has happened in Japan, which is all the workers from the high birth period start retiring. And they stop paying taxes, and they stop being productive members of society, and they start drawing on the resources of their pensions and their government. And this is the crisis that is going to bring China to its knees. Even though China seems to be flying high now, China will be coming to its knees when its worker base rent, its seemingly endless supply of cheap labor runs out. So we have that problem. We have the problem of these collapsing populations and these pension crises around the world, where People are retiring in the developed world. People are retiring faster than people are entering the workforce. And this is a drain on the government, which causes huge debt that's drowning governments around the world. The United States is another country that is facing a dire pensions crisis. The crisis in the United States is called the baby boomers. The baby boomers, which was this huge, I'm a baby boomer. Baby boomers are the children born immediately after World War II, up until around 1964. There were a huge number of babies born during this period. The GIs came back from the war. They got married. They had a lot of babies, and that seemed to be the thing to do. I mean, there wasn't much on television back then. There wasn't. The thing to do was to have a lot of babies. In fact, in my neighborhood, my family had 4 children. The next door neighbors had 8 children. There were, 6 children down the street. Everyone had a lot of babies during the baby boom. This went on until the birth control revolution of the 1960s, when we learned how not to have babies. The birth control pill was invented in the 1960s, as well as many other reliable forms of birth control, so that you can now enjoy the fruits of sex without the risk of having babies. And everyone in the developed world took advantage of this. That now women didn't have to be childbearers anymore. It was assumed in the 1950s that a woman would get married and have babies. That was her role in life. With the birth control revolution, women became liberated. There's no coincidence that women's liberation and birth control went hand in hand. We had women now pursuing all of the careers that were once reserved for men. So you have women in the 60s and 70s entering the workforce as equals to men. And this, like the demographic dividend in China, this was a huge boon to America. America essentially took over the world. After World War II, America took over the world economically. It became the world's economic powerhouse. And part of the reason for that is this demographic dividend, that it suddenly had a huge workforce that consisted not only of men, but now women, now competent women taking over many of the roles of men. So you had a huge number of people generating economic activity starting in the 70s right up into the 2010s. You have this huge workforce that is just generating all sorts of economic activity. It's generating tax activity. It's taxes for the government. It seemed like a golden era for the United States of America. And at the same time, like as in the demographic dividend in China, there were very few dependents, meaning there were, after the 1960s, there weren't many children born. So you didn't have to spend money taking care of those children. If you're a working couple, you just spend the money on yourselves. And the government didn't have to spend money educating these children. Furthermore, there weren't many old people either, because the old people were born before World War II. And actually, that was a very low birth period. That was the Depression, when there were very few babies born during the Depression and during World War II itself. So there weren't many old people retiring. There was just this massive workforce powering America to the top of the economic heap. The trouble is, we don't have the babies in the pipeline anymore to replace this population. And what's happening to the baby boomers is they are retiring. Just about now, they are all retiring, leaving the workforce. They're no longer paying taxes, and they're demanding their retirement benefits, which include Social Security that has been promised them by the government, and Medicare that has been promised by the government, and all their pension systems. And this is absolutely unsustainable. The government is going deeply into debt to try to pay for these benefits. It so happens that these baby boomers are voters, and they insist on all of these things that have been promised to them, like their Social Security. You try to cut Social Security and you're a politician, you're committing a sort of suicide, because these people vote, and they're going to vote against any withdrawal of their benefits. So America is facing this fiscal crisis that it can't get out of. And right now we have the only way that America has been able to meet its obligations to its retirees is by going deeply into debt, by issuing bonds that foolish investors buy, that are essentially loans to the government. And these loans are so big and they're so out of line with what tax revenue is that they can never be repaid. And that is the genesis of the coming fiscal crisis. Right now, as of last time I looked, the U.S. government has a debt of $21 trillion, which may seem like a meaningless number, but it is getting perilously close to the total GDP, the total economic output of the country. And the government doesn't have access to all of GDP. It has to tax GDP to find money to pay for things. So as it looks now, the government is running this kind of Ponzi scheme where it's convincing investors to buy its bonds that it can never pay back, that eventually this Ponzi scheme has to collapse. That at some point, investors really realize, when I buy a government bond, I'm buying a worthless piece of paper that the government can never make good on. So that is a crisis bearing down right now on the U.S. government that is going to result in one of the, what I think is the greatest fiscal crisis, financial crisis the United States has ever seen. Bigger than 2008, maybe bigger than the Great Depression, where everything collapses. I'm focusing right now on government debt because government debt is obvious. You can get concrete numbers on government debt, on exactly how much they owe. You can get concrete numbers on exactly what the deficit is. Right now, the government, under the Trump administration, the government is spending $1 trillion more every year than it has the actual tax revenue for, and that $1 trillion is being added every year to the national debt. And there's no way out of that. There is no escape from that. Eventually, that debt has to fail, and it's going to fail in a catastrophic way that probably brings down the entire financial system. I call this process the Great Reversal, and because it is the response to the reversal of birth rates, from high birth rates to low birth rates. It just so happens that there has been this 4 or 5 decade delay between the actual drop took place in the 1960s, but there has been this 5-decade delay between the actual drop in population and the fiscal crisis that must follow. There is no way out of this. Now, debt throughout the world is suffering. Debt is a time bomb. Not just government debt, but private debt and consumer debt is a time bomb that's waiting to go off everywhere in the world. In fact, one statistic I read said that the world's debt, the debt of all kinds of debt for the entire world, is 320% of the world's total economic output. In other words, if the world makes $100 a year, selling stuff or doing whatever the world does. The world, in fact, owes $325 a year in debt, which can never be repaid. The only solution to the worldwide debt crisis is a complete collapse that ultimately erases the debt. So I am looking for that to happen. I mean, given my condition, it may not happen in my lifetime. It will happen in your lifetime, that there will be this massive collapse in the world financial system that will bring everything down. It will bring down governments. The U.S. government without debt may no longer be a viable entity anymore. The Eurozone may break up. Big countries like Spain with separatist regions may see their separatist regions like Catalonia and the Basque region pull out of Spain. So the solutions no more are big government is no longer the solution. Big government is the problem. And once this crisis hits, the only solutions are going to be local, where local communities step in to provide the services that big governments can't provide anymore. So maybe in the United States government, federal government collapses. In which case you're left with state governments that may be able to semi-function and fill in the roles that the federal government once filled. So this is a major crisis. It has its roots in demographic processes of there being of this long delay in the baby boomer type problem, where populations have dropped and we've reaped the benefits of those population drops, and now we must pay the piper for the fact that we don't have the workers coming back into the system, new workers coming into the system to pay these absolutely huge unpayable debts. So my book covers a lot of these topics. Here's one more topic, one more demographic, one more item of demographic doom. I said there were 9 demographic processes I'm talking about. Another one is flight of talent. That is where the weaker countries of the world are continuously losing talent to the stronger countries of the world. There are certain countries I consider core countries that everyone all over the world wants to move to. And these would be in Northern Europe and North America. Everyone who has a skill, let's say you're an engineer, and you have this valuable skill that you've earned in Poland or the Czech Republic. You've gone to school to become an engineer or a doctor. And now that you have your degree, you're going to go to the place where you get the best deal, where you can make the most money and have the most professional options. And that's not going to be the Czech Republic. That's going to be Germany or France or Sweden. You're going to move in. And now with the EU, where border restrictions have been released, where anyone can move to any country they want, they are doing that. You know, Poland has to, when Poland creates a doctor, it is funding the education of that doctor. And now that doctor becomes credentialed, and he or she realizes, well, why am I staying in Poland when I can make twice as much money in Germany? And since there are no formalities preventing me from moving to Germany, I'm going to move to Germany. So you have this worldwide talent drain. It's especially hit Eastern Europe hard. So Eastern Europe is suffering from two major crises. It is losing talent to Western Europe, and it is also has a very low birth rate. So all across Eastern Europe, we are losing population because they're not producing enough babies. Latvia, for example, the fertility rate is something like 1.5. Latvians are well educated, but they're not producing enough babies to sustain their population. So every year their population drops. Furthermore, because they're well educated, they're losing their talent, is fleeing Latvia for better options elsewhere. So all throughout Eastern Europe, and as well as, of course, Greece, these are dying countries that are being sucked dry by the core countries. So you have all of these processes going on that are eating away at society. And the most critical, the biggest crisis on the horizon is this, what I call the Great Reversal, the economic reckoning, where all this debt finally comes home to roost and destroys the financial system. Essentially, banking may stop working altogether once this crisis hits. And you've got all these other problems, these talent drains that aren't helping anything. You've got falling birth rates and absolutely no way to bring them back because intelligent people don't want babies. They're intelligent and they have access to birth control. They realize this is a really bad deal for me. To have a child is like one of the riskiest things you can do. There's so many things that can go wrong in having a baby that intelligent adults avoid it. Now people are still having babies, and that's another problem because the people who are still having babies around the world are not necessarily the people you want to have babies. And there's a hard rule that the better educated someone is, the better the more economic resources they have, the more intelligent they are, the less likely they are to have children because they can look ahead and they can see the costs of this. Let's say a woman becomes a doctor and she goes through the training, which was once upon a time, it was a field that was closed to her. But now she's a doctor. She becomes a doctor. It takes 10 years or more of training to become a doctor. During that period of training, you're not going to have babies because they would simply get in the way of your education. So in the process of becoming a doctor, this woman has used up half of her fertile years simply in education. So when she's done with her education, she's become a credentialed doctor, now she can consider having babies. But even then, does it make sense to have a baby? I mean, it's going to be a drain on your bank account. It's a drain on your professional career. It's very hard to convince intelligent people to have babies. So the people who do have babies are the least successful members of society. These are the people who can't plan ahead, who work ordinary jobs, who do not have advanced education or do not have a lot of resources at their disposal. These are people who don't know how to use birth control, who don't plan ahead, who just kind of fall in love and decide to have a baby. And these are not the people you want to be creating your most important resource, which is your children. So there we have another crisis of what I call population quality. Now you can argue about whether a child is a product of nature or nurture. Are genes the most important thing to contribute to the talents of a child, or is it the example set by the parents? And to me, you really don't have to make a decision there. It's just if both are defective, if you've got both defective inferior for genes and you've got parents with low skills, you're going to have children with low skills. For example, if two parents are alcoholics, there's a very high probability that the child is going to be an alcoholic. You can argue about whether this is nature or nurture, but these characteristics are passed on. Negative characteristics are passed on between a parent and child, just like positive characteristics are passed on. The trouble is that parents that can pass on positive characteristics are choosing not to have children. They're well-educated parents. The parents with a lot of financial resources are not having children, which is the complete opposite of how it used to work. In most of human history, it was in fact the parents, the high status parents, the parents with a lot of financial resources and status in the community who ended up having the most children and having the most children survive. Because if you're a member of the higher nobility, you have more resources at your disposal to feed your children. You have a better chance of them not starving to death. So in most of human history, it was the nobility, it was the high status individuals who made the most successful babies and were probably responsible for our higher intelligence because it was the most successful members of society who survived. It was survival of the fittest went to the most successful members of society. And all of that changed, not only with birth control, but with modern medicine. What modern medicine has done since the beginning of the 20th century is given everybody a chance to survive, even if you have poor nutrition and poor upbringing. Everyone has a chance to survive because we have all these medical interventions that prevent early childhood death. So we have turned the usual Darwinism, which is survival of the fittest, on its head, and now we have our new populations, our new replacement populations are governed by, you could say, the survival of the unfittest. It is the unfittest parents who are having the most babies. So you've got all of this complex of demographic problems. Some of these things are long-term, some of these things are short-term. These are all kind of bearing down on planet Earth and turning planet Earth into a crisis zone, a hellscape. And this is what my book is trying to grapple with. Now, I want to talk about the structure of my book. My book is, I have several sections in my book. The first is an introduction where I try to have several chapters to try to pull all these things together. This is followed by a tour of the world, where I've already defined these 9 demographic processes that are destroying the world. I start touring the world and showing you how, for example, in Japan and China, these processes are playing out. And I have a little bit of, having visited 87 countries, I visit a lot of these places, and I give you some anecdotes about individual countries and how they are coping with their unique demographic problems. For example, in Shanghai, I was surprised to find in Shanghai there's a 7-Eleven on every street corner. 7-Eleven or equivalent. I've never seen so many 7-Eleven convenience stores in one place than in Shanghai. And you walk into a 7-Eleven convenience store, and right in front of the cashier is a display of condoms and a display of vibrators, of female vibrators, which you can buy right there at the counter. And being a heathen country without any God presence, these things are sold quite openly. And all this is contributing to the lack of interest in baby making by the Shanghai people, because here's condoms to prevent you having a baby. Here are vibrators so you can enjoy your own pleasures without the inconvenience of having a partner. And in fact, Shanghai has among the lowest fertility rate in the world, quite possibly less than one baby per woman is being born in Shanghai. Because you're in Shanghai, you're there to pursue your business career, you're there to get ahead. You don't need children to get in the way. So that's one little aspect of my little world tour of how demographics are shaping the world. My next chapter is about my next section of the book is about what I call the Great Reversal, which is this coming crisis where everything, all the financial world collapses. And I try to talk about debt and why this is an impossible problem. There is absolutely no solution to the world's debt problem other than an absolute collapse. Can't tell you when the collapse will happen. If I were a betting man, I'd say it's going to happen within the Trump administration. But it's going to happen sooner or later. There'll be at some point where the investors of the world stop buying U.S. bonds and decide these are a bad investment. And this leads to a ripple effect around the world where all debt collapses. We essentially have a worldwide forgiveness of debt, which means everything collapses and everything has to be rebuilt from scratch. Now, I do have some confidence that this is a one-time crisis. I do have some confidence that humanity will survive it, that we will find a new way to rebuild a new kind of economy that is not dependent on debt. But when it happens, it is going to be horrible. It is going to be terrible. Everyone will lose their job. Everyone will stop spending money they don't absolutely have to. We'll get stuck in what is called a deflationary spiral where people just stop spending money. I mean, frankly, a modern economy today is dependent on people buying frivolous things, people buying things they do not need. And when economy goes bad, as it did in 2008, everyone stops doing that. They stop buying new cars. They stop buying new houses. They stop buying fashion and marble countertops. And they stop doing all these things that they don't absolutely need to do. And that kills the economy. And that brings everything down and starts this death spiral that can only end in a terrible disaster. In the past disaster, 2008, the government was capable of rescuing us. Central banks would lower interest rates to make free money available for investment. The governments stimulated the economy by spending a lot of money on things. The next time around, we may not have those tools. For example, interest rates are already low, so you can't lower them very far. Governments have gone in deeply into debt with their past stimulus spending. They may not be able to do this again. So I think if another 2008 crisis comes along, we will not be able to handle it. We will. In 2008, it was said that we were staring into the abyss. In the next crisis, we will fall into the abyss and we will see just how far it goes. And it will be a terrible, terrible thing. So that is the second or third section of my book. The next section of my book is talking about why people don't want babies and why you would decide not to have. I mean, it was a matter of course a century ago. Everyone would have babies. You get married, you fell in love, you got married, you had babies. The wife became the mother, and you had as many babies as you could afford. And that was the way of things. And that is no longer the way of things because people have smartened up. They now have access to birth control and they can decide to have a baby. They can decide when the right time is. And the more you decide, the more you think about it, the more it seems like a bad idea. And just look at what happens when you take the sperm and the egg and unite them. It's kind of a Frankenstein experiment. You don't know what, you're messing with genes here, and you don't know what you're going to get. And maybe you get an Einstein or a Mozart, but most likely, the most likely outcome is you're going to get something bad. There are so many things that can go wrong in childbirth. Just the risk of autism, severe autism is 2 or 3%, that you could end up with a child who's a vegetable, who needs constant care for the rest of their life. And that's just in the process of birth defects. There could be, just coming out of the womb, there could be thousands of different birth defects. And then in the first years of life, there are thousands of other things that can go wrong. Your child could take a dive into a shallow swimming pool and become crippled for life. And you, as the parent, are responsible for caring for them for the rest of your life. So the more you add things up, there's a philosophy called antinatalism, which says no one should have babies ever again, which is kind of insane. But when you start to listen to their arguments, you realize they've got a lot going, that for two people to have babies, for two people to join up to have babies, which they're going to take total responsibility for, is really an insane undertaking that any rational person would not engage in. So my second section, that section of the book is talking about why people don't want babies. And you've got to address this if you ever hope to make babies again. If you ever hope to address these problems of not enough babies in the world and not enough high quality babies in the world, you have to address these problems that people have of not wanting babies for some very good reasons. I also try to address the quality problem. The problem that that all the wrong people are having all the babies right now in the world. Babies are being had by all the wrong people. All the least equipped, the most poorly equipped people are having the most babies, while the best equipped, the people who would make the best parents, who have the best resources, they are all sitting on the sidelines. So that's, you got to understand that, and the more you read that, the more dire things seem. That how do you ever convince the smart people to have babies again? So you have the stupid people having the babies, and you have all these dire demographic crises going on, and you see mankind slipping away into sort of a kind of a hellscape where nothing works anymore, where you no longer have the talent that you need in the next generation because talented parents aren't taking part in the process. Now, I could just leave it at that and say we're screwed. But the last section of the book, the part of the book I'm working on right now, offers some sliver of hope. That there is a way out. There's a way for humanity to survive. Now, I hold out very little hope. I'm not holding out much hope for humanity as a whole. We have all these dire demographic processes taking place. I don't know if they're ever going to be resolved. That does not mean that humanity is doomed, because it is within the power of some people to kind of pull themselves away from the rest of humanity and try to solve their problems in their own way. And my best analogy for this is what I call the space colony. Now, if you're a science fiction fan like I, you are familiar with a scenario where a group of colonists from a dying planet leave their home planet in a spaceship and travel many light years to a virgin planet, an unoccupied planet, where they're going to reestablish their culture. And once you get to this home planet, of course, you've got to set up your culture again, and you've got to start reproducing quickly. You've got to start making a whole lot of babies quickly to try to repopulate this planet. And of course, this is unrealistic in the real world because we cannot travel over interstellar distances. We do not have this capability, and it would be very difficult to identify a suitable virgin planet from many light years away. So it's unrealistic to expect that humanity will ever engage in this actual process of traveling to another star system. However, as places like Japan depopulate and Eastern Europe depopulate, we will have virgin worlds right here on planet Earth. And instead of having to cross interstellar spaces, maybe you only have to cross a continent to be able to find a virgin world where you and people of like mind can start repopulating the sort of culture, human culture that you want to repopulate. You can imagine this taking place in Japan. Now, Japan, if you visit Japan, you visit Tokyo today, Tokyo seems just as vibrant as it's always been because everyone moves to Tokyo. And if you're a young person, you move to Tokyo. But the rural areas, the outlying areas of Japan are dying. And they are turning into wastelands where the only people who there are many towns where the only people still there are old people who are just waiting to die. And these would make perfect places for virgin resettlement. Japan right now is not open to virgin resettlement. Japan is very anti-immigration, which is part of its problem. It will not accept immigrants. So even though its birth rate is horrible, its population is falling, it's not yet ready to welcome immigrants as the United States and Europe are willing to welcome. But that could change over time, and it could, if you had an organized effort to say, bring 5,000 colonists into Japan, Japan could very well be open to it. And I see that as kind of the ideal kind of, if you're going to start a colony, a space colony, I think 5,000 people is a good starting point. You can transport 5,000 people in your spaceships to this new virgin world where you're going to start a new life. And this last section of the book is going to talk about, well, how would you structure this sort of expedition, and how would you plan your repopulation efforts? To start off, you would be very selective. You're not going to let anyone into your group. You're going to select people who are of like mind, and basically you want intelligent, well-educated people who agree with this plan, who agree that we need to start repopulating the world, and that we need to and that we need the right kind of babies. We need to raise our children right. We need the right kind of genetic stock. We need good parents. But the traditional nuclear family where you've got one father and one mother just isn't going to work. You have to come up with some hybrid system where you are essentially distributing the responsibility of parenthood across a lot of people. So maybe you have 5,000 people in your repopulation expedition, and all of them serve as parents in some form. And you figure out a way to raise your children where it's not just one parent and one mother, one father, and a couple of children. Maybe you raise them in dorms where a family size is more like 20 children, all of them raised together in a common surrounding. What's kind of an advantage of this? Let's say you have 20 children living in a dorm, and the children of all different ages from 2 up to 18. Well, then you can actually make use of the labor of the children themselves to help raise the younger children. Now, raising children is extremely resource intensive. Just teaching a child language requires that you sit down and you goo and gaw with the baby endlessly, that you talk baby talk with the baby, that you're communicating with the baby all the time. And this can be a 42-year-old PhD holder. This can be someone who has advanced training who's doing it, but it can also be a 13-year-old who can talk baby talk to a baby just as well as a credentialed professional can. So I see in these colonies, I see these large family units of 20 children or more. Maybe a colony of 5,000 adults might have 100 of these 20 child family units. You grow up, you spend your entire childhood with this one group of siblings. So we retain this natural bond between siblings. And then you've got to recruit human bodies. You've got to recruit female bodies who are willing to bear children. Because if you're going to repopulate the planet, repopulate an area, you need to produce a lot of babies. You need to get not just one woman having 2 children, but one woman having 4 or 5 children if possible. And to convince that one woman to have 4 or 5 children, well, she's got to be compensated for that. This has got to be a lucrative position for her where you actually pay her to serve, to be pregnant and to raise a child. You probably have to raise a child. A mother has to raise a child through until they're walking, until they are weaned. If you choose to breastfeed, so some woman has to endure the 9 months of pregnancy, then another year or 2 of raising the child, and then to be willing to turn over the child to the community, which may seem like the difficult part. Now, what mother would want to turn her child over to a community? And this could actually happen if the mother comes from this family unit and is part of this family unit. Let's say the mother turns 18 within this 20-child family unit and chooses to join the pregnancy force. Well, she doesn't have to go very far from her family. She can stay with her family or near her family. She can bear the child within the family so that the entire family, all the kids in the family, come and visit this child. And so when the child becomes ambulatory, that is, when the child starts to walk and the child is weaned from the breast, it's natural for the child just to kind of be integrated into this family that is also the family of the mother. So the mother is not really giving up her child. She is simply turning them over to her siblings to raise, and she can continue to see the child as much as she wants. So that's the part I'm working on now. How would, if you're repopulating a planet, if you're organizing an expedition to repopulate a section of the planet, how would you do it? How would you organize it? How would you decide who's going to be part of your expedition? Now, this does not prevent the rest of the world from going on and doing what it is doing, which is disintegrating. So I'm not suggesting that there are worldwide solutions to demographic problems. I'm only suggesting that small communities of people can solve their demographic problems, that can come up with creative solutions that maintain their values. So if you form a community that is of 5,000 people, you're forming a community of people who share your values, who want to do things, who want to raise children the same way you want to raise them. And you're finding some isolated place where you can do it safely without too much corruption from the outside world. And hopefully if these colonies are successful, and there are a number of them, and they produce enough babies, they could eventually take over the world. But that's not at the beginning, that's not going to be possible. The only thing possible in the beginning is to try to isolate yourself from the world as though you are flying off into space to populate a new country. So even though humanity may be screwed, in the long run, there could be parts of humanity that preserve themselves and manage to preserve the best of human culture and the best of the values that we intelligent people hold dear. And so I'm hoping to leave it at that on a fairly positive note. I don't know if that will happen. The world may be doomed and screwed, but I'm at least leaving open these fairly utopian options for how you might eventually solve the demographic problems of the planet. So that's where I am. That last section is yet to be written. Obviously, it would seem that I have a limited amount of time to get this done, but I am motivated now. I'm making this video to give you an opportunity to participate, perhaps. At this point, with 80% of the book, the first draft written, I'm ready for input. I'm ready for advice, editorial corrections. You can go right now. You can go to my website. You can pick off the PDF, and if you're capable of marking up a PDF, I'm willing to look at your corrections, looking at your suggestions for how the existing manuscript can be improved. Of course, I'm also going to be in need of funds here since I've lost my job and facing some financial stress. I'm going to be setting up a funding page of some kind on Patreon or GoFundMe or something like that, so that if you happen to believe in this project, you can contribute to it and help keep me solvent enough. My needs are very modest. I don't have a lot of expenses, and my needs are modest. I just want to keep working on this project as long as I can, and maybe financially you can help out with that. So that is an introduction to what I consider the single most important project. If I can get that project done before I shuffle off this mortal coil, it would be nice to have it published by a real publisher. But the most important thing is to get it into publishable form where we are proud of it. We are convinced that it meets the needs of a market, even if a market doesn't emerge, that we've got something sellable here, that we've got something that is going to convince others that we have, that this is an important book to read. So I'm looking forward to your feedback. I'm looking forward to your corrections and your help, and maybe some of your financial support. I'm not the least bit depressed about my condition, my possible cancer diagnosis. I am energized and excited to have this opportunity to get really focused on what is really important without all the distractions I've created for myself. Travel was a huge distraction. I can do without travel anymore. The advantage of having a life-threatening disease is that you can get really focused on getting the right stuff done and getting the right stuff done quickly. So I'm really kind of excited. At this point in time, I am in no physical pain. I am very weak, in that if I stand up from this chair, I'm kind of dizzy and circling around. I obviously have some big problems inside me that have to be addressed. I'm going to have to decide at some point what sort of intervention I'm willing to accept. I'm not the sort of person who's going to pull out all the stops to live as long as possible. I am going to just simply shoot for the maximum productivity I can gain within the time that I have left. And if you want to keep up with what all my medical issues and all my thinking at the time, you should follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/BadDalaiLama, BADDALAILAMA. That's just like the good Dalai Lama. You know him, except I'm bad. And the reason I'm bad is that he gives you all sorts of useless advice, like love one another. And I'm the bad Dalai Lama in that I will give you advice, frank advice that you can really use. So Bad Dalai Lama is my handle throughout all my social media streams. So the things for you to do is to follow me on Facebook and look in on my the website for this book, which is demographicdoom.com. Pick up the PDF as it exists now. Start reading it. See if you like it. See if you want to mark it up for me, and we'll take it from there. I'm in active mode. I'm heavily in active mode right now, and I'm going to be doing lots of stuff because who knows? I could kick off tomorrow. So what's really important to me is that I do the important stuff first, and that means bing, bing, bing. Lots of stuff happening. If you thought I was hyper-productive before, I'm going to be super hyper-productive now, generating Facebook posts and essays and videos and all sorts of stuff, and this funding page and all sorts of stuff. It's going to happen really, really fast because I don't know how much longer I got. So let's get this all done fast, and I hope you can keep up. And I'm having fun, and I hope that you enjoy this as well, that we're going to get a lot of stuff done here, and we're going to save the world in our own way. So keep in touch, and we'll talk later.